Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the sports director at WGN Radio and the voice of Northwestern Athletics. Please welcome Dave Eanet to the program. Dave, it's great to have you on. How are you?
I'm doing great, John. Good to be back with you.
So, Dave, how would you characterize Northwestern's basketball season?
Well, I'd say it's a mixed bag. It's been, in some ways, there have been signs of progress, no question about that. Obviously, tinged with disappointment and a long losing streak. But I would say that overall, I think even though they didn't get the results ultimately they hoped for, or that maybe they thought they were going to get back when they started off pretty well back in December, I think they feel like they did make some steps, and the fact that they were able to kind of right at the end win a few games and maybe take a little momentum with them down to Indianapolis for the conference tournament, I think gives them some hope. They knew they were going to be young this year, no seniors on this team. And I think at times that they, kind of looked like a team that when clutch situations, late in games where they kind of needed that experienced voice to sort of help them through the rough spots. And but it's all part of the process, right? You gotta learn, and hopefully they've learned from it.
What changed to your knowledge after the Ohio State win early on?
Well, the schedule, for one thing. Even though Ohio State turned out to be a really good team and a team that's been ranked as high as the top 4 or 5 in the country, at the time they were a top 25 team, but they were a little inconsistent at the time and had a couple of injuries. And I think they got better as the year went on. But then what happened after that game, they played back-to-back road games at Iowa and Michigan. And I think that Iowa was highly motivated for that game. And certainly Northwestern had just gotten into the top 25, is getting everybody's attention. Then they go to Michigan. And it's interesting, John, it was the first time that Northwestern and Iowa and Northwestern and Michigan had ever played each other when both teams were ranked.
Really?
And so, yeah, which is one of those kind of fluky things. Obviously, Northwestern hasn't been ranked all that often, but they went into Michigan. I think people were still kind of wondering how good that Michigan team was. And they found out the hard way that Michigan, like the rest of the Big Ten found out, Michigan's really good. So is Iowa. And I think that maybe there was a little bit of a loss of confidence there after those two games. But I think the game that I look back on is having really been a sort of a pivotal moment for them that might have been the point that could have turned their season back around was the Illinois game in Evanston. And that was the game in which they dominated the last few minutes of the first half, grabbed a 16-point lead, led by 15 at halftime. And then I don't know what Brad Underwood said at halftime, but that was a much, much different Illinois team in the second half. Northwestern had no answer and only made 2 field goals after halftime. And I think that really, I think, was a setback for them because I think they had a hard time letting that game go.
I'm curious, how do you deal with a 13-game losing streak as a broadcaster? What got you through it?
Well, I've called a few. I would say that. Yeah, maybe not 13, but certainly around there. And I don't mean to make light of it because it's agonizing for the guys who are going through it, and the coaches and players. But it's one of those things where, and oddly, not being in the arena for a lot of those because we were doing the games remotely. In this case, you get a little bit detached from it. Whereas when you're riding the buses and riding the planes with the team, you see how hard close up guys are affected. And look, I haven't had really any personal contact with the coaches or the players all season. It's been all virtual. So you're a little bit removed from it, but it's tough. But you just look, it's still, and the fact is, most of these games, they were still in the game.
Right.
A lot of them, they hung around. They just couldn't find a way to get the win. So you just sort of rely on experience and rely on having called some tough games in the past and talk about what's happening on the court. And, most of the time, John, that's what happens. The game is going to dictate what you talk about and the theme of the broadcast.
What's a realistic finish for Northwestern in the Big Ten tournament?
Well, they have Minnesota first. They go in as the 12th seed, which actually they improved their seeding a little bit over the weekend. Penn State's the 11th seed, and even before their win over Maryland, they own the tiebreaker on the Wildcats. They finished tied. But then Minnesota, they had the same number of wins, but a winning percentage was the tiebreaker, and so the Wildcats are the 12th seed. And look, Minnesota has really struggled. Now, everybody starts fresh, and that's, of course, what you always hear going into a conference tournament. But Minnesota's lost 7 straight games. A lot of speculation about the future of Richard Pitino with that program, and they've had a couple key injuries, which I think are a big reason they had this losing streak with their big man Liam Robbins and also Gabe Kalsher. So I haven't heard lately what their status is. It seemed like Kalsher in particular was not expected back for the tournament. Not sure about Robbins. They didn't play on Saturday in their last game, but I think Northwestern can win that game. And then they go against Ohio State. Look, they beat Ohio State once, and they played them pretty tough in Columbus. So I wouldn't write that game off just yet. And again, if you look at the bracket, they're not in a bracket where you look at it and say, boy, this is out of reach. This
Right.
is something you can't do. Because if they were to beat the Buckeyes, they would go against Purdue. And I think Purdue is really good, and probably, along with Michigan, really the most surprising team in the Big Ten this year, maybe even a little more so. But again, Northwestern played them tough in West Lafayette, and they tend to play pretty well against Purdue. So I think realistically, for them to win a game or two down there would be the right ending and probably an appropriate ending and a ending that would give them some hope and a sign of progress looking towards next year when, right now they got their whole team back for next season. Now, obviously, in this day and age in college athletics, you never really know year to year who's going to be there and who's not, with the transfer portal the place to be. But, I think if you look at it right now, they're bringing all these guys back. They got some good recruits coming in, and they should take another big step next year.
Dave Eanet here on Sports Talk Chicago. Dave, how bizarre was it to broadcast during COVID?
Well, very much so. And I think I probably speak for all of my colleagues who've done this, that it took a lot of getting used to, starting in football stadiums without fans and continuing it with broadcasting from a studio, broadcasting from a basketball arena without fans, and then broadcasting from a studio for road games and calling the games off video monitors. I mean, it's something that I had done a little bit, John. I tasted a little bit because there have been times where for different broadcasts I've done for a WNBA game here or there, or Big Ten Network did some games where you're in the studio calling it off the monitor. So I had done it a couple of times before, but never on a regular basis. And to go to a conference room that had been turned into a radio studio to do the games was sort of an odd experience, and especially because there are things that happen that you really can't prepare for because of the technical aspects of it that you're relying on, where you're not watching the event with the naked eye. You're watching it on a signal that's being transmitted to you from a long distance away. And so once in a while you lose the video, or it's a blurry picture, or something happens, and it's a little tough to fill in the gaps, but you do the best you can.
What's the most challenging part, would you say, of broadcasting from a studio?
Well, I think that there are two things. First of all, you feel, and I kind of alluded to this before, you feel detached from it.
Right.
You feel like you're removed from the game. It's like you're watching a game on TV, and you don't feel the energy from the fans. Now, even if you're in the arena, you don't feel the energy from the fans, but at least you're in the building. You kind of have more of a sense. You see the whole court. You kind of get a feel for the way the game is going. If you're watching it off a monitor, a lot of the time you are at the whim of whoever is sending you that video signal. And I have to tell you, sometimes it's been great, but sometimes just because of the issues of transmission and whatnot, it can be challenging. For instance, we were doing a game from, I believe, from Penn State, and the picture kept freezing. So literally, John, the ball would be in the air. Like a guy would be shooting a free throw, and the ball would be in midair, and the picture would freeze. And the next thing you know, it has jumped ahead to the two teams going the other way down the floor. So, you're scrambling to try to figure out whether the shot was good or not. Now, you do have some technological advantages. For instance, I have a stat monitor, which via Wi-Fi, sometimes that's running ahead of the video picture. So I'll look at that, and that can be a good thing. That can be a blessing, but it could be a curse, because sometimes you look at it and it will have already counted a basket that you haven't seen yet. So you look at the score, and the score is not what you think it is. So, I mean, it's just little things like that takes getting used to. And I talk a lot to my colleagues around the Big Ten about the challenges they faced. I've picked the brains of other broadcasters who've been through it. Jeff Joniak, the voice of the Bears, is a good friend. We talked a little bit during the fall about it. And there are just different things that you don't encounter when you're doing a game in the stadium or in the arena, but you have to roll with it. Look, I'm not about to complain, because there are a lot of people doing all kinds of jobs that have had to find new ways to get their work done, and have had to deal with all kinds of challenges, much tougher than anything I've had to deal with this year.
How concerned are you about this becoming normal in the future?
Well, that's a concern. I mean, that certainly, from a financial standpoint, obviously college athletics were faced with a lot of economic challenges, like all sports really this year, without fans, and you do worry a little bit. But I think that people in the sport, John, at least at the Big Ten level, at the major conference level, understand the importance of having their broadcasters on site. And look, if I had really jumped up and down and yelled and screamed, maybe I could have been at some of these games. But quite frankly, there's a risk involved there for me as well, and for the other people on my crew, that didn't seem worth taking. Now, hopefully that changes as we look towards football in the fall. I've gotten the vaccine. I think the other people on my crew have already. So perhaps that will change the circumstances involving our travel as we look towards the football season and then the basketball season. But I do worry a little bit about it, because we've shown you can pull it off.
Right.
And that is a concern. But I honestly believe that the people in the sport and the people who make these decisions understand the importance of us being in the building to call these games, and to be able to sense the crowd and get a feel for the game. And those are things you just can't do off a monitor.
Dave Eanet here on Sports Talk Chicago. Dave, are the White Sox World Series contenders this year?
Oh, I think absolutely they are. I say that with a tinge of caution, because it seems like more often than not, every time we've thought a team was a World Series contender around this town, and I've been covering sports here for a long time, hasn't necessarily worked out that way. In 1984, the White Sox were coming off their AL West championship, the winning ugly season, And I think everybody sort of assumed they were going to win it in 84. They fell short. It was the Cubs in 84 who came out of nowhere and kind of captivated the city by winning the National League East. And then everyone assumed the Cubs would come back and win in 85, and they didn't. So there is kind of that feeling when the hopes are set high, and understand this. I'd rather have the high expectations, John. I'd rather have people thinking, okay, this is a team that can contend for a World Series title. It's better to have that than to have, oh, well, here we are. Yeah, this is going to be a team. Maybe they can get a wild card if they catch lightning in a bottle. I'd much rather have the hopes where they are. And I think it's legit. I think you look at their lineup. I think you look at not only the pitching staff as it stands now, but you factor in the moves they've made to strengthen that staff over the last couple of years, starting last year with Keuchel and continuing with Lynn, and then adding a terrific closer to the back end. And you already had a solid bullpen. So I think this is a team which I think should contend. But, people have to remember they still have to overcome the Minnesota Twins in their division. The American League East has some pretty good teams, and there's some teams in the West that aren't exactly slouches either and have a pretty proven track record. Oakland has been a pretty good team, even though they lost some guys from last year. So, I think it's going to be a tough road for them, but I certainly think that they are legitimate World Series contenders.
Could their youth get in the way a bit, do you think?
Well, I think sometimes youth can be a good thing because the guys don't necessarily know they're too young to win. And I think that was a big question going into last year. And there was a lot of talk about the importance, especially with a young team on a condensed schedule, on a 60-game schedule, that it would be really important for them to get off to a good start if they were going to win. And they did. So I think that having been through that, I think that youth, if anything, I think that it's youth with experience now. And I don't see youth being a big hindrance, even though it's a young team with a lot of young talent. I mean, it's young but experienced talent coming into the 2021 season.
What about the Cubs? Where are they right now to you?
I think they're kind of a big question mark. And I think I don't think the Cubs are going to fall off the edge of a cliff like a lot of people think or are concerned they might. Obviously, there are some issues. Can this pitching staff come together? You gave up one of your most dependable starting pitchers. And certainly, I think you know what to expect from Kyle Hendricks. You don't really know what to expect going into this season from Jake Arrieta. Hopefully, he can be what the Cubs hope he will be. Same with Trevor Williams, who I think might turn out to be okay, and Zach Davies. Again, these are kind of question marks, even though these guys have pitched in the majors and have a lot of experience. But I think that there's some question marks there. Can Craig Kimbrell be the guy they hope he can be and that he maybe showed signs of towards the end of last year? I think they're going to score runs, and I don't think that's going to be that much of an issue for them. But the only thing that worries me, really, John, is it's a pretty tough division, and so is this a team that now is playing for an NL Central title, or are they trying to come up with a wild card again? And because they're going to have a tough time with the teams in the NL Central. You look at this division, and the Cardinals and the Brewers and the Reds. I mean, it's not going to be an easy road for them. But again, I think that for them to win, to be a plus 500 team, I think is very reasonable to expect. And I think if you're in that conversation, you're going to be in the mix for a postseason spot. And, I think you take your chances there.
Dave Eanet, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Dave, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, the most memorable baseball game you broadcasted is what?
You know what? I used to fill in for Pat Hughes once in a while on Cubs broadcasts. But I have to tell you, when I was filling in on those games, the Cubs weren't very good. The years I had them. I mean, I did games, John, in 2014, and that was the last time I did them. And of course, 2015, all of a sudden, they made it to the NLCS. But I think it was a series. Actually, I did a 4-game series against the Mets in New York. I can't tell you, there was no walk-off hit. There was no dramatic moment. I wish I could tell you I did a really memorable game. But most of the games I did, unfortunately, were pretty forgettable.
How about your favorite interview, coach or player? Who would that be?
My favorite interview? Well, you know what? It would be hard to say that he's not my favorite because I talk to him so much, and that would be Pat Fitzgerald. Because I've probably interviewed him more than I've interviewed anybody in my career over the years, both when he was a player and then he was an assistant coach and certainly as a head coach. But, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the days when I used to do the post-game show on Bears Radio in '85 and would interview the players in the locker room. And the interviews with Walter Payton in the Bears locker room were always unforgettable because Walter, and I'm sure you've heard the legends and the stories, but Walter was fidgety. And so he wouldn't stand still for very long to do an interview. And when he was standing still, he would generally be grabbing you in a way that today would be termed inappropriate, or punching you, or in some other way trying to disrupt your train of thought. Always amusing, always entertaining, and really, when you get right down to it, even though he loved to have fun with the media, he was a good man who would tell you how he felt when you asked him the right question.
And Dave, before we finish up today, last question: what's the award or honor you're most proud of in your career?
The award or honor I'm most proud of. You know what? I think the honor I have to be most proud of, John, and I have been fortunate. I don't I don't like to talk about awards or honors much, but this was one that when I finished or when I got to my 25th year broadcasting Northwestern football, at halftime of the season opener, Jim Phillips, the athletic director, grabbed a microphone down on the field, and we were doing an interview at halftime. I was in the booth, he was in the field, and he said, Dave, look around behind you in the booth, and they had put a plaque on the door and named the radio booth in Ryan Field after me. And that blew me away. I had absolutely no idea that it was happening. And I'd have to say, of honors or awards I've received, that's the one of which I'm most proud.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to have you on, and best wishes as the Big Ten tournament ramps up. Hope to do this again soon. Thank you so much.
John, anytime. You always ask great questions. Always good talking to you, and continue the great work.